I don't want to interrupt your eating, but I would like to interrupt your talking. Thanks. Please feel free to continue with your meal. Enjoy and help yourself to more if you feel as if you need some more. Every care conference, we attempt to suggest some thinking that's outside the box. And we've done some of that today. You're all aware of that, of course. But something that is way outside of the box, we have today two majors from the US Army who are involved in assessing risk and uncertainty for the US military. These are Major Jones, who's going to speak to us tonight, and his colleague, Major Palazzini. These people have practiced risk and uncertainty. Major Jones, who's going to speak with you, has had 2 tours of duty in Iraq. He teaches assessment of risk and uncertainty at the US Military Academy. He is well trained in finance. He has an MBA from the esteemed Duke University, and had wanted to talk initially about assessing risk and uncertainty and the way he sees the things that he learnt at Duke and the way they apply in the military. We ask him not to do that. We ask him to talk more about exactly what he sees as assessing risk and uncertainty in the US military. This man has had experience doing this, and perhaps one might consider the worst of circumstances. So I think we're going to have an enjoyable presentation. I'd love to introduce Major Hugh Jones.
Thank you. Test. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thanks for the introduction. Many of you have asked quite reasonably what I'm doing here, so I thought I'd briefly explain. Trevor Harris called my boss, Colonel Peterson, who's the head of economics up at West Point, and he said that the conference needed someone who could explain how the Army addresses risk and uncertainty. Unfortunately, all the qualified people were busy, so they sent me. So I'll be speaking about that. I think it's important to frame my perspective and provide a little bit of background. I'm an infantry officer, so if you don't know what that means, if you've seen Black Hawk Down, the movie, that's sort of what I've done in my Army job. And I'm a rotating faculty member at West Point. So for the past 2 years, I've taught economics and finance up at West Point. And then following this assignment, I'll return back to the infantry and do that. I'm not speaking from a financial perspective or an economics perspective, but rather from an Army perspective and how the Army deals with risk and uncertainty. I heard one of the gentlemen who spoke earlier talk about how risk and uncertainty is fundamental to the insurance business. I can assure you that risk and uncertainty is more fundamental to the Army. The costs are different, but they're very high, right? It's not just professional embarrassment, right? It's not just the loss of money, but it could be your life or the life of your soldiers and subordinates. So the stakes are quite high, and it's very fundamental. So without further ado, this is the agenda. I'll also be speaking about, I'll provide some brief anecdotes on how this is actually executed and implemented, and I'll also provide some potential applications to business or how it is applied in business and how I've observed that. Clausewitz was the first one to use the analogy, the fog of war, and he was an 18th century Prussian military theorist, and he said, in war, fog clouds decisions. It clouds decisions like uncertainty. The military defines risk and uncertainty differently. I've heard some discuss it, that without uncertainty there is no risk, but the military is different. We consider risk to be known hazards. Those are hazards that we can identify, hazards that could affect the mission. It could be something mundane like a vehicle accident or something much more serious like an IED or a roadside mine. Uncertainty is the unknown unknowns, or the thing, as Secretary Rumsfeld put it, or the things that we can't specifically identify. If you were using Annette's framework, I think that the quantitative enthusiasts would fall under risk, and the quantitative skepticists would fall under uncertainty. And I should also mention that I'll be speaking from a tactical perspective. That means from, if you like, a boots-on-the-ground perspective. As you increase in echelon in the Army, these processes become more sophisticated. First, I'll talk about risk mitigation. And again, this was covered to some degree by Steve Gursky. I think he stole the Army's model. But this is mitigating identified risks. So any risk that's identified falls into this process. First, the risk is identified. Then we assess the risk, and the risk is assessed based on probability and severity. So you could imagine encountering a roadside bomb, tactically very severe, probability, depending on where you are, very likely, versus a nuclear explosion. Probability is low, but severity is extremely high. So we assess these risks initially based off of that probability and severity. From there, we develop controls. The controls reduce what we call the residual risk. So we then evaluate that residual risk and decide if we're going to proceed. So this is sort of like a cost-benefit analysis. Cost-benefit analysis is a little bit cold because in the end we're talking about lives, but it is a cost-benefit analysis. There's always some risk inherent in military operations, so we do that cost-benefit analysis. Once we make the decision to proceed, that the benefit outweighs the cost, then we implement those controls. We supervise and evaluate, so are the controls effective? And it's a leader's task to supervise those. And it's a continuous feedback loop. If we encounter a risk that we haven't allowed for, then a new risk control is identified. If there's some sort of catastrophic event, then the process wasn't done carefully enough. And I'll give you a brief example that will explain how this happens. On my second tour to Iraq, my company inherited the most heavily IED'd road in the world. There was an incidence of 8 IEDs per week, and these were armor-penetrating mines, mines that were detonated by our enemy. Pretty much every single mine that was detonated resulted in friendly casualties. So the severity was high, the probability was high. This was a serious risk that I had to develop a control to mitigate. So how do you mitigate these different types of this possible event? The mitigation is I can change the time that I move, I can change the method, I can walk, I can fly, I can drive, I can change my route, I change my pattern so that I can avoid getting targeted. And additionally, I can take efforts to go after the enemy and interdict his capability to emplace these weapons. But this is an example of how I would do risk mitigation in a tactical environment. We were generally fairly fortunate with that, and we didn't suffer too many casualties from that, and we were able to reduce that IED frequency or improvised explosive device frequency from 8 per week to about 1.5 per month. That was a success story. The downside to the Army's focus on risk mitigation, and it's probably similar in business, the downside is that by such a focus on risk mitigation, every single risk must be mitigated or the plan is not complete. You can become excessively fixated, and it can lead to a risk-averse culture. And in the end, we're an action-oriented organization. So you always have to balance that. I have to mitigate the risks as the leader, but I also have to reinforce action. I have to take the initiative and be aggressive to win in combat. So that's a delicate balance. And it was Napoleon who said, "If the art of war were nothing but the art of avoiding risks, glory would become the prey of mediocre minds. I have made all the calculations, and fate will do the rest." Uncertainty mitigation. Uncertainty, again, is the unknown unknowns. Those are those things which we haven't fully identified. And the Army has two main routes that it tries to mitigate these through. There's the information-focused solution and the action-focused solution. The information-focused solution focuses on reducing our uncertainty while increasing the enemy's uncertainty. We do that through information superiority. Essentially, we want better information. We want to process it faster, disseminate it quicker than the enemy. In addition, we want to confound the enemy's efforts to gather intelligence through counterintelligence and military deception. In terms of prediction, we avoid precise predictions, and instead we plan for a worst-case scenario and a most likely scenario. Finally, we have a red teaming process, even at the small unit level, in which someone plays the devil's advocate to try to ensure that there's no cognitive bias. Finally, there's the action-focused solution. The action-focused solution acknowledges that some uncertainty is unavoidable, and we want units that can fight and win with uncertainty. We won't be able to predict everything. There will be unexpected things that happen on the battlefield. There may be a sandstorm. There may be a riot. We don't know everything that's going to happen, so we want to build units that will thrive in uncertainty, and that's the focus of the action-focused solution. I'll go into a little more detail on the information-focused solution. It was Sun Tzu, 2,500 years ago, who identified that intelligence is what allows a commander to achieve victory. It is the decisive element. Information superiority is guided by information management. Essentially, this is about relevant information, and I'll define relevant information on the next slide. Again, the bottom line with this is we want to gather more information faster, process it quicker in a more meaningful way, and in addition, confound the enemy so we can react quicker to situations as they develop on the ground. I thought of a good business application to this. I was speaking to a friend of mine who works at a hedge fund, and I was speaking to him about my presentation, and I was explaining the information management or information-focused solution. And he said it was the same for long equity funds, that it wasn't enough to do better analysis. It wasn't enough to have better information, but it was the conjunction of the two. Better analysis and better information was their competitive edge. And to quote him, he said, "You can't wait for the annual report to start your process. You have to interview customers, competitors, suppliers, do background checks on management, etc." This is exactly what the Army seeks to do. Better information, better analysis, faster to the right person at the right time to make the decision and complete the mission. The first step in information management is collect, and I do think there's some benefit to the business community from this. This is an unrelenting, uncompromising focus on gathering information. Every single asset we have is focused on gathering intelligence. Everything from spy satellites, drones, to the individual soldier. Every asset seeks to gather intelligence. And we have different categorizations of information. We have information we would like to know about the enemy that will tell us what the enemy is going to do. For example, at a crossroads, did the enemy go left or right? Once we know where the enemy is going to go, we can template out their progress from that point forward. Then there's information we have to know about ourselves, friendly forces information. And then there's information we don't want the enemy to know about us. If we have a weakness, or if we have overloaded forces on one side, that's information we have to protect. And that information is protected through deception and counterintelligence. And I'll speak to that a little bit later. To apply this to business, I'm not sure everything is legal, right? So if the lawyer's still here, he can help me out. But I don't think you can have paid informants. I'm not sure what the boundaries are, but the Army doesn't pull any punches, right? We have the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, spy satellites, spy planes, eavesdropping. There's no rules. Well, let's not say that. There are some rules, but it's less restrictive, let's say. So I'm not sure exactly how far you can take this, but I do think an important lesson is that everyone in the organization is focused on this information. Leaders put out this intelligence, and the intelligence is gathered. As a reconnaissance troop commander, I was one of the assets on this slide that would gather this intelligence. The next step is processing. So you can imagine, with everyone in the organization focused on gathering intelligence, it's like an enormous vacuum cleaner. It sucks up all this information, all this data, but it's not relevant unless it goes through some kind of process that adds meaning. So we gather the data, we filter out what information is useful, fuse it, put it together in some sort of common database, prioritize it, And the goal is for the commander or the decision maker to achieve understanding. It's connecting the dots. And examples of this abound in the business community, but from my limited experience, one of the best ones I've seen is Walmart. Walmart obviously has a strong presence in the market, and they gather a tremendous amount of information, and they use that information to their advantage. This is fairly straightforward. Once information is gathered, we need to store it in some sort of centralized database. This was an issue for the Army at the outset of the GWOT, the Global War on Terror. We had many different databases, different agencies, the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, the DIA, the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps. Everyone has their own systems, and the systems don't relate. So we need common systems. And once we have this information, it can be tremendously useful on the battlefield. And this, I think, is a particularly good story. This is a biometric device. What happened is, in a foreign country with no standard identification, when you don't speak the language, it can be very difficult to tell who's who. So the Army developed the Bats and Hides system. It's a database that we would collect the biometric information of a population, of different people on the battlefield. And with that portable device, we could then identify people. And if we didn't know them, then we'd scan them in and we'd have their data. We could start to build this database. What this allowed us to do was identify people, which can be very useful. On my first deployment to Iraq, many times we would encounter fighters who had been released from detention, and now we're finding them again on the battlefield. And there's no way to identify them until we get them back. But this system can speed up the processing. And we were able to identify bad guys who have come back. So for example, if you're patrolling and you come across a group of 9 military-age males and you scan them with this system and they've all been former detainees, then you might know that you need to investigate the situation a little bit more. And it assists with identifying who's who. Display. The Army has a myriad of ways to display information. Everything from sandboxes that are built to scale. We call them terrain models. We also have the Blue Force Tracker, which is this screenshot down here in the bottom right-hand corner. Every commander, every small unit leader has a mobile display which has all the locations of friendly forces and any known enemy locations. The point is that information has to be displayed in an intuitive, useful manner. It's not enough to have the information, to have processed it, to have stored it, but it has to be intuitive and easily understood. Sort of on the same line of thought, there's different ways we can disseminate the information. We can disseminate it to all or one-to-one. We have written orders. This is a shot of the Blue Force Tracker I mentioned earlier in the middle. And then, of course, the radio. The Army errs on the side of disseminating too much information. While the essential information that we don't want the enemy to know is safeguarded, soldiers really dislike not knowing what's going on. And every effort is made to keep them informed. I think the business lesson is your subordinates know what they need to know to execute effectively, to take the initiative, and how quickly and effectively is that information disseminated. I think the Army does a good job of that. In addition to achieving information superiority for ourselves, to collect it better, process it quicker, disseminate it in a more readily understandable manner, we also want to confound the enemy's ability to understand. And that's where counterintelligence and military deception come into play. Counterintelligence is really going after the enemy's collection assets. It's sort of spy versus spy. We want to interdict their collecting agents. Military deception is not trying to interdict their agents, but rather feeding them false information. You could see in the top right-hand corner, that's an inflatable tank, right? They're holding up there. In the bottom right, this is World War II in the top right. In the bottom right is a more recent example. This is a soldier in Iraq who's made a dummy to try to solicit an enemy sniper to take a shot and reveal his location. The idea is we're feeding the enemy false information to provoke some sort of mistake that we can exploit. It adds to the enemy's uncertainty. I heard a bit about precision forecasting and the inability to do that in uncertain environments. And the Army's application or consideration for that is to avoid precise forecasts. Every mission, at a minimum, is planned based off of the most likely and the most dangerous enemy course of action. So the most likely and the worst case scenario. I think you could maybe say the worst case is sort of like a black swan. What is the worst thing the enemy could realistically do? The plan is built around what's most likely, but the plan, to be complete, must also mitigate the most dangerous or the worst case scenario. And I can sort of explain how this works in execution. This is an operation that I did in south of Baghdad in 2006. What you can't see here is that we were expecting the enemy to employ IEDs or roadside bombs in this area right here. Because we expected that, we allowed for that in our plan, and we made sure to adjust our movement technique. In fact, they did place IEDs along the side of the road. One of those we found before it was triggered, so we saved some lives there. In addition, because we expected the enemy to try to do this, we had aerial assets that were observing the area, likely areas for them to emplace IEDs, and we were able to use those assets to interdict their IED emplacement teams. We also, in this case, ended up using the most dangerous course of action. The most dangerous course of action came into play, and that was that we would receive artillery fire from a remote location, because I was dismounted at the time on my feet, and if we received artillery from the other side of the river, we'd have no immediate response, no way to mitigate that, no way to control that. So this was a serious concern. And again, because it was part of our planning, our most dangerous course of action, not something expected, but something that could seriously impede mission success, we allowed for that. And we had Apaches, the gunships, the helicopter gunships, that were orbiting on the east side of the river that were able to interdict a mortar team. In this case, both plans came into effect, although it is unlikely that the most dangerous course of action happens. I think the lesson from this is that we avoid precise predictions. We try to figure out what we think the enemy is most likely to do, but then we create a plan that allows for the most dangerous course of action as well. Lastly, in the information-focused solution is red teaming. Red teaming is a devil's advocate, and this is really an effort to avoid cognitive bias. I'm sure many of you have heard of groupthink, and in Army organizations that are particularly tight and cohesive, this can become a problem. In red teaming, someone deliberately takes the opposite view. Someone's there to question your assumptions, to play the role of the enemy, and this happens at every level. Even at my level, when I was in combat, I had 135 soldiers under me. Even at my relatively small level, I had two subordinates who I would pick to play the devil's advocate and to make sure I had someone to question my assumptions. Next, I'll briefly discuss the action-focused solution. The action-focused solution acknowledges that despite our best efforts to have information superiority, to mitigate uncertainty, there will be some uncertainty. Because there will be some uncertainty, our way of business, our modus operandi must allow for that. We also have to have units that will fight and win with this uncertainty. Our modern theory of battle command, the way we conduct our operations, was developed by a Prussian field marshal, von Moltke. Essentially, von Moltke realized that through micromanagement, the battlefield was too uncertain for that one commander wasn't going to be able to control everything, and that as soon as there was contact, as soon as we engaged the enemy, things would change. And this leads itself to the importance of initiative. Initiative is crucial under the action-focused solution. In addition, we have this framework, Mission Command. Mission Command decentralizes execution and empowers subordinates through commander's intent. And I'll explain that in a second. This gives you some more details on Mission Command. Essentially, on the right-hand side, you have micromanagement, and on the left-hand side, this is the Army's approved way of doing things. It allows for uncertainty. A commander gives general guidance and provides boundaries, and then subordinates execute within those boundaries. Mission Command provides the who, what, when, where, and why, but leaves the how to the subordinate. Again, the focus is on allowing for initiative. I'll discuss commander's intent and subordinate's initiative separately, but for mission orders, again, they provide the who, what, when, where, why, but leave the how up to subordinate commanders or leaders. Resource allocation is a way for leaders to, one, ensure that the mission can be accomplished. You have to provide adequate assets to do whatever task you've been assigned. And in addition, it provides weighting. What is most important? The mission that's most important will get the lion's share of resources. Commander's intent. Commander's intent is essential for any type of Army operation. Subordinate leaders are required to take initiative. They're required to take independent action to complete the mission, but they can't do that without some sort of understanding, some sort of visualization of what the commander, what their boss wants. Typically, this is done face-to-face, and I think one of our speakers earlier talked about just sending memos and emails isn't enough. There's something about face-to-face communication that conveys additional meaning and ensures understanding. Commander's intent, whenever possible, is delivered face-to-face, and it provides the purpose, decisive point, key tasks, and desired end state. The purpose is, why are we doing the mission? What's the purpose of doing this? Decisive is, when have we achieved success? For example, if I'm supposed to isolate a block of buildings in central Baghdad, once I've achieved my positions around that block, that's decisive. Once I'm there, I own the real estate, the enemy can't go anywhere, and the block is effectively isolated. The key tasks, what are things that are necessary for me to achieve success? And then what's the desired end state? Where should friendly forces be, the enemy, with respect to terrain, at the end of the mission? These boundaries allow subordinates to exercise initiative. And as I mentioned earlier, subordinates aren't just allowed to take initiative, they're required. They must take initiative. So I have a small example of this. On one of my deployments was specifically to target al-Qaeda and foreign fighters that were in Iraq. And we would do large-scale missions in helicopters, where helicopters would land us. We'd operate on the ground for 48 hours and try to collect the bad guys and then pull them out. One mission, we were going after a particularly bad guy. He was the head of al-Qaeda in Iraq for all of northern Iraq. It was a big priority target. Just as we were about to leave, through talking to some of the locals, we learned that his brother was 2 kilometers away. This is an hour before we're due to get picked up. There's no time to walk up and make it back to get picked up by the helicopters. And this is a battalion-sized mission that involves at least 15 helicopters, so it can't get bumped to the right. One of my subordinate leaders took the initiative to compensate some locals for some bongo trucks, some Kia-type pickup trucks, and you can imagine a bunch of soldiers piling into some rickety Iraqi trucks and driving down the road to get this brother. But sure enough, they did secure the brother and they brought him back. And without initiative, it wasn't specified that we used local trucks when we couldn't get from point A to point B in time. But through this initiative, we were able to accomplish the mission. And this is a critical piece of how the Army works. They are expected to take initiative. In addition, we have to build organizations that are capable of winning in uncertainty, and this happens through units are started right from the beginning with a focus on uncertainty and ambiguity, that this is a reality. Flexibility is encouraged, and we don't rigidly enforce doctrine. There's not an approved solution. What's important is achieving the mission. The means, as long as they're legal and ethical, is not evaluated. Doctrine provides a framework that's adjusted to get to the end state. And this is an example of cadets at West Point recently. You can see that they're role-playing with local nationals. And I can tell you there's no approved solution. There's no right or wrong answer for how you negotiate with a sheik. What's important is that you achieve the purpose. And soldiers are trained from that right from the beginning. So in conclusion, the Army defines risk and uncertainty separately. Risk are the hazards that we know and can identify. Those risks are mitigated. If they occur, then the mitigation was was incomplete, and we'll refine that mitigation. And that's a continuous feedback loop. And the example I provided was the IED example, how to control and mitigate that. Next is uncertainty, and we have two ways we deal with that. One is through information superiority. In this case, we know there will be uncertainty. We know there will be uncertainty. We know that there will be things that we don't know, but we want to be the first to know them, the first to understand them, and the first to push that information in a usable form to the decision maker, and we push that out as wide as we can. Additionally, despite our best efforts to have the best intelligence, the best processing, the best dissemination, some things will just happen. There'll be sandstorms, there'll be riots, there'll be unexpected developments. So we want units that thrive in that environment. We want flexible units. Mission Command provides that framework. Mission Command focuses on the who, what, when, where, and why, but the how is left up to individual commanders or subordinate leaders, and that allows for initiative. Initiative is not just recommended or possible, it's required. It is that subordinate leader's duty to take whatever initiative he has to complete the mission within the commander's intent. Lastly, we start training right from the beginning that uncertainty is a part of our operations, and we want to develop and maintain units that thrive in that environment. This concludes the presentation portion. I'm happy to take questions. I've done a little research on where the Army falls short on their risk mitigation uncertainty. I'll be happy to answer questions on that. I could talk about West Point. I'm a graduate and I teach there. I could talk about the Army and current operations. And yes, at midnight I stopped getting paid. Thank you. Thank you.
So thinking about what you guys do as a business. So the revenue stream is very uncertain.
It is.
You know, in a sense, you see it all the time, the politics of the revenue stream. I'm just curious as how the cost structure, you know, whether you guys feel, how much impingement you feel in terms of when there's a lot of political pushback on the revenue stream, how your lives are affected by the cost structure. And anyway, that's the
so I may have a different definition, but I'll tell you how I think about this and how I talk to my subordinates about it. So it's a good question. You ask your subordinates to put their lives on the line for political reasons that they may or may not agree with. So life is simple and complex with boots on the ground. It's simple in that we do what we're told, right? We have political representatives, and we're bound by the law to do whatever they tell us to. So in that sense, it's simple. But of course, people are more complex than that. The revenue stream, what's the benefit? How do you measure the benefit? The benefit is both tangible and intangible. One way to measure the benefit is fewer IEDs on the road, right? So I mentioned that when I showed up, it was 8 per week. You had U.S. soldiers dying every day on the road, and then through some pretty extensive and difficult efforts, we were able to reduce that to 1.5 a month. So that's a visible, tangible reward. In addition, it's a little maybe inappropriate, but when you fight with the enemy and you're alive and they're not, that's tangible feedback that you've done a good job, right? When you're arresting bad guys, that's tangible feedback. So I would equate security, removing bad guys from the population, and a reduction in IEDs is my revenue. My cost would be friendly casualties, and always want to lower your cost, but risk is inherent in military operations, as I mentioned in the risk mitigation part. I think a good military quote, one that you'll hear frequently, is that we don't take gambles, we take risks, right? So we take calculated risks, and it's up to the individual leader to determine if he's made the right call. I don't know if I answered your question. Does that do it? Okay. Go ahead.
First, let me just say thanks for a fantastic talk. I really enjoyed that, and from the applause, I think we all did. To me, the novelty, I mean, the thing I didn't expect was how decentralized you're trying to make the decision structure in order to deal with risk. And my question is about performance evaluation. So to what extent, you touched on this a little bit, to what extent are outcomes evaluated on the basis of outcomes, on what happened, as opposed to on following the process, and how does that differ on the upside and on the downside?
Yes. Well, as you can imagine, the peacetime army, the garrison army, is different than the wartime army. In the wartime, there are very tangible, obvious outcomes that can be evaluated. In the peacetime, it's more difficult, right? So we're training, and I think evaluations are more difficult. In combat, it becomes from my experience, it's pretty apparent who's doing a better job. There's very, very tangible, undeniable feedback. How many friendly casualties have you had? How secure, how safe is your area? And we don't just do kinetic operations or shooting bullets. We also do development projects and things like that. So how much have you helped local governance? I think in combat there's tangible feedback that can be evaluated objectively. I think in peacetime it's much more difficult. So would you like to know how it's done?
Really, bottom line is, if you follow I assume the FM was the field manual?
Correct.
So if you follow the field manual...
No, that's not good enough.
If you don't follow the field manual and things go well, is it really just about outcomes?
Yes. But of course the Army is, there's exceptions to every rule, but the Army is very focused on legality and ethics. So while I say what's important is the outcome, it must be achieved legally and ethically, of course.
I've actually had a chance to watch training exercises during peacetime. I've been very impressed. Took back to my corporate setting some of the lessons I learned about the intense feedback provided during training exercises. Now, I don't know what actually happens in wartime, whether as a commander you would be asking your subordinates to tell you what you could have done differently after an exercise. Could you talk about that and explain the culture?
The Army does one of the things the Army does very well. The Army does some things poorly, some things well. One is we have an after-action review process we call it AAR, and it's after every major action, whether it's training or wartime. You come together and you talk about it, and the end result is sustains and improves. Sustains are things that went well and things that went poorly. And truthfully, after every single operation, you will conduct this after-action review, and you do identify what went well and what went poorly. And no one is off limits. It's conducted professionally, but no one is off limits. If my subordinates had something that I could have done better, they could say it, and vice versa. So that process I think is a good one, and it helps us to learn from our mistakes. And it happens both in wartime and training.
Yeah, I have a question which probably has a parallel with the corporate world as well. Sometimes in corporations, the people at the top are doing things which aren't necessarily appropriate or correct. And it's a big problem because you need to have some way for the whistleblower to sort of get the information out. And you've had cases of it happening in the Enrons and the WorldComs and so on and so forth. All of us have probably seen the movie Crimson Tide, where there's a issue in a combat situation where there's some sort of disagreement between the top person and the person below and stuff. But how does the Army deal with situations where your superior, you believe, is doing something which is either incorrect, tactically, or even unethical, but yet you have a chain of command to follow?
those are sticky situations. In peacetime, it's not as big of a deal because normally it's not time sensitive. So in peacetime, there is a chain of command, and normally you just bump one up, right, and go to your boss's boss. Of course, the Army values loyalty, so that is not a riskless task to do. There's some uncertainty and risk in that. But if it's something immoral or illegal, then of course that's what you have to do. In wartime, it's more difficult because sometimes there can be lives on the line. And I'll tell another story. There was a time when I had a separate platoon. So a platoon is 30 or so guys, 30 or 40, and I had 3 platoons, actually 4 platoons under me. And I was doing a mission with 3 of them, one place trying to get a bad guy, and another one of my platoons was sort of minding the farm back in my area. And my separate platoon was had a sustained gunfight, so they're fighting with the bad guys. And I can hear them, and of course, you care deeply about the other organization, so I wanted to go help them. And for whatever reason, my boss would not let me go. And what I later learned is that because I was out on the battlefield, and my boss was to the rear, I could hear their radio transmissions, and he could not. So I was in range, and he was not. And I could hear that they were running low on ammunition, and he could not. But you can imagine it's really frustrating, unbelievably frustrating, because I am lawfully bound to do what I'm told, right, by the law. If I don't do what I'm told, it's breaking the law. My boss is telling me I can't go to help this platoon that's running out of ammo. So to be honest, I had planned I was just going to go, right? While I was arguing with my boss on the radio, I was also talking to my subordinates, telling them how we were about to leave and give them the plan. And my intent was just to go. I was just going to go and deal with the consequences after I got back. Now, fortunately, while this was going on, he finally changed his mind and I got to go. But if we had been ready to go and he would not have let me go, I would have gone anyway and just dealt with it. And in the worst case, I would have been done. I would have been relieved. But I think once he knew the situation, it would have been okay. So I think the answer to your question is, in the Army, if your boss is doing the wrong thing, if it's something that is not urgent, you wait until there's a moment to go above him, and of course that's a risky venture. If it's wartime, you have to make a judgment call about whether you're going to put your career on the line. But I think that happens every now and then.
One more question? Thank you.
Thank you.